Hello, folks. It's Bradley J, and we're live on the Bradley J Show with Rich Rubino, who is a political analyst, an author, and a speaker, and really super interesting cat. I think his political knowledge, his knowledge of political history, might blow you away. Thanks for being with us, Rich Rubino. We're going to talk about the midterm elections,
Yes.
and we'll look at them. We'll look at them in history and see maybe which ones most closely mirror what's going on now and what that might portend for this one, and maybe some of the ramifications of the results of that. And I do want to start out with this question.
Yes.
Not being a political expert myself, I noticed that after one party wins the presidency, the executive branch, then they lose seats. Is that always a thing? Is that the standard? And why is that?
It's almost always the standard. There are a few exceptions to that. The last one we saw was 2002 when George W. Bush's Republicans, in the wake of Afghanistan, 9/11, the Iraq War was popular at the time. The Republican Party actually picked up 9 seats. And that was the first time that happened in a first midterm election since Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1934. And similarly, in 1998, Bill Clinton's Democrats actually picked up seats in this House in the House of Representatives, the first time a party picked up seats in a 6 year of a presidency since James Monroe in 1820. So you ask the question, why is it that a president's party, generally speaking, loses midterm elections?
Right.
Well, first of all, point to those two exceptions, Bill Clinton and George W. Bush, and Franklin Roosevelt did as well. In the case of Bush and Clinton, both presidents had job approval ratings well over 60% at the time of the midterms. So what that shows is that presidential approval rating is generally a pretty good barometer of what's going to happen in a midterm election. If it's over 60%, the party actually has a good chance of picking up seats.
Wow.
The only exception to this, 1974, Gerald Ford and the Republicans. Gerald Ford actually lost 47 seats, but his party, I mean, he rather had a job approval rating of about 54%. But part of it was the afterwash of the Nixon administration, and Nixon had a job approval of 24%. So generally speaking, whoever the president's popularity is an indicator here. Now, why is the president popular when he gets elected, and then 2 years later, why is there almost a precipitous decline? Well, part of it is that the presidents tend to overpromise and underperform, and oftentimes they make promises about the economy, and sometimes their way of stimulating the economy, trying to decrease inflation, whatever it is, has not gotten into full effect until after the first midterm elections. So, take for example Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan gets elected in 1980. 1981, he proposes a tax cut. 1982, to deal with the proliferating deficits, he signs a tax increase. So in 1982, the country is not out of the recession. There is still inflation, and you had Paul Volcker, a Carter appointee, essentially raising interest rates. So voters took it out on Ronald Reagan, who they elected overwhelmingly in 1980, and the Republicans lose 26 seats. Bill Clinton in 1992 gets elected, talking about it's the economy, stupid, or we're going to put a laser focus on the economy. 1993, he proposes a tax increase, and mostly on wealthy Americans, but that tax increase by 1994, Republicans are running all over the country saying this Democrat voted to increase taxes, voted with Bill Clinton. So consequently, Democrats and moderate Democrats and some Republicans soured on Bill Clinton. The Democrats lost 53 seats in the House, and the Republicans picked up both the House and the Senate for the first time since 1955. That they had both branches. But then the economy really started to improve the next few years, and Bill Clinton gets reelected overwhelmingly in 1996. So that's generally it's a harbinger. And the other factor, frankly, is there's usually buyer's remorse on the part of the party in power. People say, we have elected this person to do all this, to do this, to do this, and they haven't done all this. They haven't done everything we've elected them to do, so we're not going to show up to the polls. Meanwhile, contrary-wise, on the Republican side of the other party, their voters are saying, we got this guy in office because we didn't show up last time around. We really have to show up this time. So they're going to show up in the midterm. They're going to show up full throttle, and they're going to show up not necessarily to vote for their party, but to vote against the other party. So that's usually historically why that happens.
Man, now how does that all apply to what we're doing now?
Yes. Well, so here's the thing. So Joe Biden right now, job approval rating is right around 40%. So theoretically, ceteris paribus, all things being equal, his party should be losing about 30 to 40 seats. But there are a couple of variables that would make it so that does not happen. The first is there just aren't that many seats that are actually competitive in the House of Representatives. And many conservative Democrats who were elected in the 2018 election ended up losing their seats in 2020, all of them freshmen, with the exception of Colin Peterson of Minnesota, and all from mostly from swing districts. So that means there just are very few actual vulnerable Democrats who come from districts that are not 30% Democrat and the other side Republicans that are 30% the other side. Now the other factor, there are a couple of variables for Joe Biden. One of them is the fact that Donald Trump continues to be in the news, and that is something that galvanizes Democratic voters. So you need something to galvanize your own base, and a lot of people are not necessarily galvanized by Joe Biden, but they're galvanized because they don't like Donald Trump and they want to go to polls and vote against the Republican they think is allocated to Donald Trump. And the other factor in favor of Joe Biden is the Dobbs decision, which essentially overturned Roe v. Wade. That is galvanizing the body politic. That is galvanizing some people who are kind of low propensity voters because of that issue that potentially could come out. So that is kind of the wild card. And the other issue, Mitch McConnell spoke about this at a Louisville, Kentucky Chamber of Commerce when asked about the race. He said that we have candidate quality issues, meaning essentially, usually, if it's a generic ballot, generic Republican, center-right Republican versus generic center-left Democrat, the center-right Republican should be winning. But in places like Georgia, in places like Ohio, their candidates tend to be underperforming. For example, in Ohio right now, Mike DeWine, Republican, is up for re-election. He's ahead by about 20 points. Now, contrary to that, the Republican senatorial nominee, J.D. Vance, is in a statistical dead heat. So that's a 20-point difference between the governor's race and the United States Senate race. State of Georgia, exact same thing. Brian Kemp is well ahead in his race for governor, the Republican, but Herschel Walker, the Republican nominee for the United States Senate, is down by 2 or 3 points in that Senate race. So that's another potential issue.
People seem to blame or give credit to the president for the economy. It's all about the economy when it comes to presidential elections. But the president doesn't have all that much
Right.
To do with the economy for a couple of reasons, because they just don't. And the other thing is it's a slow-moving ship, which, and you kind of alluded to this, it takes years to turn around, and people are getting credit or blamed for stuff that either has happened long ago or will happen in the future. It's wrong to vote for a president based on the economy, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. It's a complete misnomer. People seem to think that presidents of the United States have kind of almost, plenipotentiary powers over the United States economy. They can just wave a wand and jobs are created, inflation's created, or just decreased. But they actually don't have that much power over it. There are so many other variables. We saw Jimmy Carter got involved in this, for example. When Jimmy Carter came in, he was blamed for deflation. Essentially, I mean, he was blamed rather for stagflation when both unemployment and inflation were increasing, which actually began before his presidency. But a lot of that goes back to, first of all, you can go back all the way to Lyndon Johnson when he paid for guns and butter for Vietnam and the Great Society. And then you can go back to the OPEC embargo in 1973. So there were a lot of other factors that had nothing to do with Jimmy Carter, but Jimmy Carter gets in there, and Jimmy Carter is automatically blamed for this. Same thing, Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan comes in 1980, and he talks about how he's going to fix the economy. But in 1980 itself, as I just said earlier, so aforementioned, Paul Volcker raises interest rates. So obviously, when he raises interest rates, that is going to effectuate a decline in the economy. But people immediately, blame Ronald Reagan for that. Bill Clinton, the same thing. Bill Clinton comes in 1992, laser focused on the economy, and then the economy does not appear in some parts of the country to have improved as much as a lot of people think it did. So people immediately blame Bill Clinton for that. So it really is, it's basically, there's so many things going on in world markets, so many things presidents don't actually have hegemony over, but we tend to view presidents almost like they're monarchs and they can just wave this wand.
Well, what are your predictions in this midterm?
Yeah, I could be completely wrong on this because of these unknown variables, but right now, I'm going to guess in the United States Senate, It stays exactly what it is right now, 50-50. And Kamala Harris is going to break the tie. So the Democrats obviously will maintain control of the Senate. By the way, do you know the vice president is actually paid as a member of the legislative branch because she's president of the Senate, not as the executive branch? And Joe Manchin will still be essentially omnipotent for the next 2 years. This is going to be remembered sometime. You know, when we look back 73 years from now, this is going to be remembered essentially as the era of Joe Manchin, if you will, simply because of happenstance. The House of Representatives, my guess is the Republicans pick up about 15, maybe 15 seats. It's going to be a lot more modest, although I'm starting to change that projection because I'm seeing some polls now that's showing that they're hedging a little bit here, that the Republicans are doing a little bit better right in the kind of the last 2 weeks of the election. And if that happens, then if the Republicans have a very slim majority, the first thing that happens, so Nancy Pelosi, she's running for re-election in the San Francisco district. She is not going to be, I can't envision a scenario where she either runs for minority leader of the House of Representatives at 82 years old or decides I'm going to be a backbencher congresswoman from San Francisco. So my guess is she's going to announce that she is going to resign her seat. There'll be a special election in San Francisco. Then the question is who's going to supplant her as minority leader? You have Steny Hoyer next in line, who's in his 80s, and Jim Clyburn after that, who is also in his 80s. And so the question is, will the Democrats pick some sort of a placeholder, or they go for someone a lot younger in leadership like Hiram Jeffries, the chairman of the Democratic caucus, to try to take over the party? If the Democrats do continue to hold the House of Representatives, which would be almost unprecedented, then my guess is Nancy Pelosi probably breaks the promise she made a few years ago that she would not seek re-election as Speaker after the 2022 midterm elections, and it'd be a very volatile race. But again, so much of this is just so unpredictable because there are so many variables that you don't see under a normal operating procedure here.
Right. So that answers this question, which I didn't post. Will Pelosi be gone? You figure yes. All
Yeah.
right. Hey, can you talk a little bit about? And this is off the page a little bit. A recent progressive group sent a letter to Joe Biden, super foolishly, I have to say, urging him to negotiate with Putin. Tell me about the ramifications of that. Not to overuse the word ramification, but then he withdrew the letter. How massive a mistake is that, and how does that play into the hands of the Republicans, etc.?
It's going to be essentially a non-issue, I think. For one thing, there are a lot of Republicans who essentially view it the same way. This is kind of where Pat Buchanan's Mercedes rams right into Ralph Nader's bicycle. This is where the right meets the left.
Yeah,
right here. This is where politics is not a continuum. It's a horseshoe or even a circle. And this is where Pat Buchanan and Ralph Nader are meeting. So they're anti-war Democrats, and which you can go back certainly to Vietnam, Eugene McCarthy wing, for example. And then on the Republican side, there are anti-war, non-interventionist Republicans, go back to Robert Taft from 1952, for example, who eventually say that the United States should mind their own business, take care of America, and stay essentially out of overseas conflicts.
Was it Kevin McCarthy that said we're not going to write a...
And the right wing, the libertarian wing of the party are essentially meeting, and both parties have about 30 members of essentially anti-war, and they are kind of meeting on this. So it's kind of an interesting amalgamation here, but essentially I don't think it's going to mean anything electorally. They withdrew the letter, and even Bernie Sanders, by the way, said that was a good thing for them to do. So this is essentially going to go by the wayside, I believe.
One difference between the people on the right and people on the left that would like to get out of this war is the reason for it. The Republicans don't want to spend the money. The progressives say we want to negotiate with Putin. That was the nuts thing as far as I can see. All right.
Well, there are some. Tulsi Gabbard, for example, who was a former congresswoman from Hawaii, ran for president last time. She was seen as one of the most liberal members of the House of Representatives when she was there. She's one who's essentially she's become. She's running around the country supporting Republican candidates. She supported Dan Bolduc in New Hampshire. She supported Kari Lake in Arizona, for example. She says that Joe Biden now is a quote-unquote warmonger. And that is something you do hear from some people on the left. And you heard it, by the way, the exact same thing on the left from Barack Obama. Barack Obama, you remember, increased troops, put three more brigades into Afghanistan. and supported predator drone strikes. You had folks like Noam Chomsky, for example, saying that Barack Obama was essentially worse on military policy than George W. Bush. And you do have this kind of right-left coalition, and they are anti-war sometimes for different reasons. By the way, on trade, the exact same thing. That's Pat Buchanan and Ralph Nader on the same page in trade, for example. So you have trade and you have foreign policy, where the right and left are essentially kind of meeting right here. It's really a fascinating epiphenomenon here.
All right. Well, before we go, I want to make sure everybody knows what you do and what you can offer. You're a speaker. You can speak to people's organizations. You also have 5 books. Why don't you run through the books again? They're awesome books. I have one of them.
Yes, the first one is the Political Bible of Little Known Facts in American Politics, then the Political Bible of Humorous Quotations in American Politics, then Make Every Vote Equal, What a Novel Idea, then American Politics on the Rocks, and the most recent is the Great American Political Trivia Challenge, Political Trivia on Steroids, essentially an interesting look, if you will, at American politics from kind of actually a fun angle, which is good in this time where we're so unified.
And you do speaking engagements, which I think is really cool. How do folks get in touch with you?
Yeah, you can just contact me. Actually, the best way would probably just go on, would be a couple of ways. You can go on Twitter, certainly Rich Rubino, Rich Rubino POL, Instagram, Rich Rubino MHD, or on Facebook, just type in Rich and then Rubino, RUBINO. You can see a picture of me holding up the book, and that's probably the best way that you can contact me. I do a lot of speaking at senior centers, for example. I'm doing a lot of speaking certainly on these midterm elections, and certainly anything about the electoral process.
All right. What do you think is going to happen with the Department of Justice? I was going to be done, but not. My brother says that the Department of Justice will not have this, whatever you want to call it, to go ahead and charge Trump.
Yeah, I have no idea. I know that for Merrick Garland, the Attorney General, if he does not charge Trump, I think there's going to be a real backlash amongst particularly the anti-Trump left, and it'll be very hard to see a scenario where he essentially says we don't have the evidence here. Now, the other side of that, and this is such a fascinating question, is if Donald Trump decides he's going to run for president, announces essentially right after the midterms, then how are other Republicans going to play this? Are they also going to say with Donald Trump that this is all a setup, that he's being framed, that this is part of the political process? Or are they going to say, you know what, Donald Trump has so much baggage. This is why you need somebody who will have a similar message but will not have the baggage of Donald Trump. Is he opening himself up, in other words, there for a criticism from another Republican who holds the same ideology but does not necessarily have the characteristics or some of these scandals kind of permeating his multiverse, if you will? So it is fascinating. I don't know whether they're going to indict. My guess is that it's just very hard for me to see Merrick Garland going to saying that essentially he has nothing, and that there's not enough to indict on this.
I'm hearing more and more Republicans are saying that Trump will not be the nominee and should not be the nominee. Is that what you sense?
Yes, most Republicans do not want him to be the nominee. Just by looking at after January 6th, when Kevin McCarthy, Lindsey Graham came to the House and Senate floor respectively and essentially excoriated him. Lindsey Graham said, "This is where I get off." Kevin McCarthy says essentially that Donald Trump bears responsibility for this. But then both of them kind of came back to Donald Trump because they saw the polls. They, I think, thought at the time that Donald Trump's base was going to be asunder and they were going to just kind of leave Donald Trump, but they did not leave Donald Trump. And most Republicans know that Donald Trump is more popular in their Senate, in their states or their congressional districts than they are. And they're very trepidatious, for example, that Donald Trump comes out, or certainly during the primary process, that he endorsed a primary opponent, because he does this over incumbents, or in the general election that he will come out and he will essentially tell benefactors, tell donors, don't give to this guy. So that's why most Republicans, I think, are at least pretending to have some sort of admiration for him. But most of them, I think, want somebody who is clean of the Donald Trump, who is not Donald Trump, let's put it that way. That's what most, at least establishment Republicans want. They would want somebody other than him. But it'd be very hard to make the case during a primary with his ecumenical name recognition support in the Republican Party for them to say, you know what, I'm not going to support Donald Trump in the primary unless they're complete never Trumpers, and they will have a candidate as well in 2024, potentially outgoing governor of Maryland, Larry Hogan, Will Hurd, the former congressman from Texas, who was an anti-Trumper, or Adam Kinzinger, or Congresswoman Cheney, both on the January 6th committee, who potentially could be candidates. So there will be a candidate for the anti-Trumper, but it'd be very hard for somebody to say who's somewhat supportive of Trump's policy, say, I'm going to support somebody other than Donald Trump who has very similar policies in a primary. Very interesting.
People talk about DeSantis all the time, but other people say he's like an uncharismatic dud. Like, really,
Yeah.
right? He gets a lot of traction now, but when you get him out in front of people, he's kind of a dud. What's your take on that?
So he just had a debate last week, and his debate with Charlie Crist, the former governor, former congressman, in the Democrat, and right now he's ahead by about 10 points. But in that debate, it's interesting. Charlie Crist, they had agreed beforehand. Why Charlie Crist agreed to this, I don't know, not to ask questions of your opponent. But Charlie Crist, during his time, said, yes or no, governor, I want to know, and this is what I thought he would do, will you serve out your full term as governor? And Ron DeSantis hedged. He had a great line. He said, the only Democrat I want to put out to pasture is Charlie Crist, rather than talking directly about Joe Biden. But the fact that he will not answer this question directly, and the fact that he does not do a lot of media interviews where people ask him this question over and over and over again, will you serve out your full term, means essentially he's already decided, I think, that he's going to run for president, that he assumes he's going to win re-election, and probably even if he doesn't win re-election, he'll probably still run for president in 2024. It's going to be fascinating to see how you can run this third largest state in the country, where you have an active legislature at the same time running for president. In Texas, George W. Bush did it, but in Texas, the legislature only meets 90 days every 2 years, so it's a little bit different scenario. But so I think he's definitely going to run right now. I think if Donald Trump does run, he's going to try to get to his right and say we had all these shutdowns around the country, mask mandates. We didn't do this in Florida. Why didn't you try to halt these nationally and try to get kind of to his right? Interestingly, I'll say that I agree that he's somewhat charismatically challenged, but I don't think voters are at the point where they vote on charisma. I think they vote more on ideology. So I don't think that's going to necessarily have deleterious effects on him. But I do think Donald Trump is probably thinking right now, last time around in the primary, I supported you against Adam Putnam. Adam Putnam, the Agriculture Commissioner, was the front runner, and I supported you in that. And then I really got your name out there, and I got you so you won the nomination. Then you barely won the governorship of Florida. So in a sense, I made you. Now you're going to essentially kind of go against me. So that would be a very bitter rivalry.
Interesting. You feel that people vote on ideology rather than charisma.
Now,
and I feel like that's not. I feel the other way. I like Donald Trump. His ideology. He was a hypocrite ideologically, but he had a lot of charisma.
Well, but here's the thing with Trump. The reason I think Trump won is actually more ideology than anything else, because unlike every Republican president from Eisenhower, Nixon, Ford, Reagan, Bush, all the nominees, Dole, Romney, when it came to issues like trade, Donald Trump was not an exponent of free trade, and he would go to places. He would go to Pennsylvania. He would go to places like Erie County, Pennsylvania, coal country. He would go to all these places and he'd say, you've lost your job, and part of that was because of free trade. I'm going to bring your job back. Now, there are other factors, certainly automation, globalization, technology, but he went to these places and he overperformed in a lot of these places, not because he necessarily liked Donald Trump the person, because he's actually saying that I'm going to bring your jobs back. The other issue, social issues. Most Republicans, when it comes to the issue of who would they nominate for a Supreme Court justice, say, well, there's going to be no litmus test. George W. Bush said this back in 2000. He said it again in 2004. Donald Trump said specifically, well, I'm going to nominate candidates who are opposed to Roe v. Wade, who are overturned Roe v. Wade. So consequently, you had evangelical Republicans who certainly in the deep South, who certainly have no cultural allegiance to somebody from New York City who's lived a very secular lifestyle. All of a sudden they're saying this guy's going to do what we want him to do. So I do think that now there's a few exceptions to that. Bill Clinton is the one that comes to mind. When Bill Clinton ran in 1992, He was probably the most conservative candidate in the race in the Democratic primary. Probably too conservative for the Democratic base, at least him. You had, maybe Paul Tsongas was somewhat fiscally conservative, but he won the nomination because people just generally liked him as a person. But that was 1992, and they also thought that, wow, this guy is really stimulating. But now you go to 2020, we're in such a polarized time that it's an R or a D, and it's basically essentially, do I agree with this person ideologically, and how far in the Republican side it's how much of kind of a Trump populist Republican is that candidate.
Okay, Marjorie Taylor Greene. Marjorie Taylor Greene, her influence will increase if the Republicans do well in the House, correct?
I don't think so. I think the Republicans are going to do everything they can to make her kind of a very much a marginal figure, and that's what they essentially want her. She got elected. She's from a very conservative district, North Georgia. Other than Dalton, the furniture capital of the world, most of that is very rural and very conservative. You got to remember her, and this is the same thing with Lori Bobart from Colorado. They're freshman members of the House of Representatives. They're not members of the leadership. They're not chairmen of committee. They're not chairman of any subcommittee. In the case of Marjorie Taylor Greene, they're not even on committees. The only reason you hear so much about them is because they are so volatile in terms of their rhetoric. To the media just kind of gravitates toward them, just like AOC, for example, on the Democratic side. But in terms of having actual influence within the caucus, no, I don't think that.
Okay, good.
I don't think Marjorie Taylor Greene, the Republican Party, the last thing they want going into 2024, if they're a majority, is to see her become a household name. And then when somebody's running for re-election, all of a sudden you see these pictures like you're doing now with Joe Biden. You see this candidate voted with Marjorie Taylor Greene 95% of the time, and showing Marjorie Taylor Greene, because everyone will know who Marjorie Taylor Greene is, with this moderate Republican from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. It's just something that they don't want. They're essentially going to treat her as they're going to essentially treat her as this kind of distant cousin, and they're very rarely going to actually mention her, I think.
All right, we did get one question. This is kind of on the fringe of stuff I would include, but what is your take on this? USA doesn't have elections, no hand-counted paper ballots, no elections. That's kind of an extreme way to put it, but what is the effect of what he's saying? Is that true? No hand-counted paper ballots? They do. There's hand-counted paper ballots somewhere, right?
I think they do have them. I think they do. I don't think it's universal that they don't have them everywhere.
Okay. So, and what do you make of this statement by Big Bad John?
Is he saying? So, what is the statement that elections?
I have it right in the front here. If you can see, it says USA doesn't have elections, no hand-counted paper ballots, no elections. Is that just?
I mean, I guess that is certainly a theory that some people that believe that. I guess that could be. You could make that case for the last two elections. There are some people that think that if there aren't necessarily hand counted ballots, that means that the elections essentially could be rigged. I don't think it's necessarily an establishment opinion, but there are certainly some people who believe that.
All right, I'll go ahead and put this up there. Just how do you respond to this? Can you see these comments when I put them up?
Oh, I do now. Yeah.
So what do you make of this comment? Big Bad John is correct. I don't understand how this is related to Big Ben John's statement, but Darren Burrell says that USA is a fascist police state, the Fourth Reich of the Nazis. Is that at all true?
I don't think so. I mean, that's certainly a fringe position. People are entitled to. I'll try to be as politically correct here as I can. I mean, people are certainly entitled to hold that position, but I'd like to know kind of why you believe that it is a fascist state. But that being said, there are certainly people on both. I'll say this, on both ends of the spectrum now, and even center-left people that say under Donald Trump it's become a fascist state, and there are people on the right who say that if the Democrats get elected, it will be a fascist state. So the word fascism is certainly thrown around a lot more liberally than it was, in the pre-Trump era.
I want to bring up one more thing that I brought up last time we spoke, and this phenomenon in which progressives are hating on Joe Biden so much that they support Trump. That is cutting off your nose to spite your face. I don't know why they do it. It's to have some sort of identity, to stand out in the crowd, just like Marjorie Taylor Greene. You say crazy stuff, the algorithms pick it up. Social media algorithms pick it up. You get a lot more traction, but it's kind of harmful, right? Because you know that if you're a progressive, supporting Trump is really counterproductive at the end of the day for what you believe in.
I don't think it's that most of them actually support Trump. I think a lot of them, it's more, there are some issues where Trump and progressives agree, and trade is one of them. Sometimes foreign intervention is another one. Remember, Donald Trump was the first president since Jimmy Carter not to have actually attacked another country. So there are some things where progressives can agree, and I think Donald Trump kind of trying to decimate NAFTA, for example, is one thing that they would agree on. But most of them, it's not that they like Trump; it's that they view Joe Biden as a corporatist, a warmonger. I think they go back to his views in the United States Senate when, for example, he voted for the Iraq War, when they thought that when he had hearings as chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, and they thought that dissident voices were essentially ignored. So they never really had that positive a view of Joe Biden. When he ran for president himself in 2008, he won about 1.8% of the vote, and almost none of that was from progressives. It was more kind of establishment Democrats. So you always have the scenario. Lyndon Johnson got it. Jimmy Carter got it all the time, by the way. At one point, George McGovern, who was the party's nominee in 1972, came out and said, essentially, if you voted for Jimmy Carter in 1976 over Gerald Ford, you're now getting the same policies as you would have had if Gerald Ford was president. Carol O'Connor, who played Archie Bunker, came in a political advertisement for Ted Kennedy and said essentially that Jimmy Carter is essentially masquerading as a Democrat, but he's really a Republican, and he shouldn't be in a Democratic primary. So you always have this scenario. Bill Clinton certainly got it. Bill Clinton was kind of interestingly in 1992, as was aforementioned, he was probably the most conservative candidate, but he won the nomination because people thought, let's get nominated a Southern Baptist, a moderate, and we're not going to have the Dukakis problem. We're not going to be seen as a Northern elitist, as kind of this elitist liberal party. Then when Bill Clinton actually does get elected, there were certainly some Democrats who were very hostile to him. Maxine Waters in 2000 questioned whether she would take back her support from Al Gore after Al Gore suggested that Elian Gonzalez should stay in the United States. Remember that the refugee who the Clinton administration sent back to Cuba. So you always have this scenario, but certainly if you listen to anything Noam Chomsky said about Barack Obama, for example, you saw essentially the same thing. But I don't think most of them are actually going to go to the polls. If they go to the polls in 2024 and they don't vote for Joe Biden, it's probably going to be for the Green Party nominee, not for Donald Trump.
Is Joe Biden going to run again?
I don't know what his thinking is. My guess is if he is not going to run, he's not going to announce till about March, because once you announce, you're automatically a lame duck. And if you're a lame duck, then both parties essentially kind of ignore you, and they're always already talking about who the next president is. I think that Joe Biden, I think he views himself, though, as a transformational figure, in the same way as FDR or an LBJ in terms of getting domestic legislation through Congress. I think his wife certainly wants him to run. I think he probably views himself as the only Democrat who can upend Donald Trump if Trump is the nominee in 2026. And I think he sees himself as having this legacy. He's had a congenital interest in the presidency. Remember, this is a guy who gets elected to the United States Senate before he's constitutionally eligible to serve. He was literally 29 years old. The next year, he became 30 before his inauguration. And all of a sudden, people are already talking about this guy's going to be the next Jack Kennedy. This guy's going to be the president of the United States. He tries to run in 1987, and then there's a plagiarism scandal, drops out. Thinks about it in 2004, drops out. 2008 runs, never gets anywhere, then becomes vice president. Then 2016 he does. In 2020, he decides he's going to run again. Obviously, the elephant in the room is the age issue. And at 80 years old, there are some people who have led countries in their 80s. Konrad Adenauer in Germany, for example. Will he look at the rest of his life and say, do I really want to spend my last years as president, or do I want to go back to Delaware and kind of enjoy my grandkids? But my guess is he sees himself as a transformational figure. And right now he's probably thinking, yes, I'm going to run.
I guess I have to ask who might replace him? Who might run if he doesn't? Who might do well if he doesn't?
Well, I think that there's going to be a litany of candidates. I think Ro Khanna, congressman from California, is trying to take the mantle as kind of the tribune of the Bernie Sanders, a younger version of the Bernie Sanders wing of the party. I think Ray Cooper, the governor of North Carolina, is probably, from kind of the Clinton, Jimmy Carter standpoint of electing moderate Southern governors, is probably the most formidable candidate the Democrats have. And I think he wants to run. The problem he has, this Republican lieutenant governor, under North Carolina law, every time the governor is out of state, the lieutenant governor becomes governor. So accordingly, you would have a Republican governor being governor of North Carolina while Governor Cooper is out running for president. But he's probably, I think, the best candidate they have. Former mayor of New Orleans, Landrieu, is somebody who I think is probably considering running. I think they're also probably going to be. There's probably, by the way, going to be a bunch of Democrats that no one's ever heard of. Some Democrats, assuming Tim Walz gets reelected as governor of Minnesota, he's somebody that's probably going to position himself. Amy Klobuchar, the senator from Minnesota, has certainly gotten some high yield, some name recognition from overperforming in her last presidential campaign. She's somebody I think is probably going to run. Pete Buttigieg has been a surrogate all over the country, very popular surrogate speaking for Democrats. He did the right thing, by the way, by running for president last time. If he had run for governor of Indiana, he probably would have lost, because Indiana is very much a red state, and he was mayor of South Bend, which is a blue city in a red state. So he knew he had to go national. Instead of running for governor of Indiana, he runs for president. Not necessarily because he's going to win, because he's going to garner name recognition. And he did that, and that helped to secure him in the position of transportation secretary. And now he does have a base, and he does have a position to run himself. And of course, you're going to see Vice President Harris probably trying to take up that mantle of a presidential candidate in kind of the Biden wing of the party, if you will. But her problem was, when she ran last time around, she failed to garner support even in the African American community. So it's very hard to see kind of where her base of support is. Usually the vice president, the president's not running for re-election, whether it's Richard Nixon, whether it's Hubert Humphrey, Al Gore. You can go back. They usually run to succeed that president, and usually they end up losing in the general election. But the point is, they usually end up running to succeed. So I can't envision a scenario where she doesn't run, but they also don't necessarily see where her base necessarily is.
All right, Rich Rubino, I should probably leave something for next time. I planned on like 15 minutes, and now it's 40 minutes.
Oh my gosh.
I know you have a life to lead. You have a life to get out there and lead. So thank you, folks. I want to remind you about Rich, and then about the stuff for me. Rich has got 5 books. They're awesome. Rich Rubino, Rubino. Just Google it, Amazon it, and you can have him perhaps speak at your organization. How do they get in touch with you again?
Yep, just go to Facebook and just type in Rich, R-I-C-H, and then Rubino, R-U-B-I-N-O, or just Google my name, and certainly many things will come up.
Right on. And folks, if you would do me a favor, I would love it if you would subscribe to my YouTube channel and click on the bell to get notified. There's the Bradley J Travel channel. There's the Bradley J Show. There's Bradley J Personal. There's also my band called Bridge Bender. And I guess that'll hold us for now. Thank you very much, Rich Rubino.
Thank you so much, Bradley. I greatly enjoyed it.
Okay, good. Don't leave me now. Don't leave.